In comparison, if I wanted to create an, I don't know, integer variable owner ID, and somehow call another method named getOwner ID, and provide this method, maybe it's a private method that returns an integer, get owner ID, and somehow it computes it. I don't know, we could generate a random number, or I can return 1, 2, 3 for now. Then this attribute right here would be qualified as method attribute, also known as local attribute, also known as local variable. Right? So owner ID right here, you can talk about it as the method attribute, local attribute, or local variable. These are all acceptable names for it. And its visibility, of course, is this only method level, right? So in my case, it's a constructor, so owner ID is only available inside this particular method, which happens to be class constructor. So if I wanted to demonstrate how I could use this, maybe I could go to my main method and say driver license equals new, of course, a driver license, because we need to tell a Java compiler that right now we're definitely creating brand new object and we'd like to use it, right? So we have the default constructor, which we use in this application for this class, and so we can create brand new object like that. Okay, so these are examples that we're trying to talk about here, right? The visibility, just to make sure that we refresh this. There's also class attribute, and this is the case which was specified in the previous slide, where we said, well, you know what? What if we somehow wanted to share an attribute between multiple objects of the same class to demonstrate this? So I could say, okay, how could I possibly demonstrate it here? Well, maybe if I go to my driver license class here, I could create a private static integer owner ID sequence, right? I could do something like that, owner ID sequence, and it's an integer which is static, which means that if I create multiple instances of these licenses using the new operator, then they all will share the same static attribute. So what I could do right here is that I could just say increment this, just add 1 to it, and by the way, I can successfully initialize this to 0, for example. The first time, by the way, the initialization is taking place on static attributes only once. So before the first object of driver license is even created, the static attribute will be initialized to 0. Okay? And then every time I want to use it on this line right here, I can say, okay, let me just bump up the number and store it backwards, and then, by the way, also return that number. Now, this seems to be the possibility. I mean, just let's say we're using class level attribute in our get owner ID method. Get owner ID, by the way, is not, of course, is not a static method anymore. So, and it gets called by the constructor, which of course is invoked for a particular instance as soon as a particular object is created. However, it has access to this, and therefore, if I say let's add a couple more useful, perhaps over here I can add, say, operations, and I can say public integer get ID, owner ID. Well, perhaps I should make owner ID an attribute. How about this? I will say private integer license ID. How about that? Internal license number of some sort, and I will initialize it right here in the constructor. The constructor will say license ID equals owner ID, just for the sake of demonstration. How about that? So license ID gets initialized. This is, of course, another object attribute. Perhaps I can have the section here named, in general, object attributes. Right? Object attributes. Well, typically programmers don't create those type of comments. However, I do keep comments such as constructors and operations in my classes so that I can easily identify parts of my class where I'd like to keep those operations together, data attributes together, and so forth. So get license ID. Right, so I have license, and I would like to say get license ID, a little getter method, which will simply say return license ID. Return license ID. As you can see, the license ID is initialized by the constructor of an object. Okay, so get license ID. So this way I can go to my main application, create a couple of licenses, say license 2 and license 3, and now I can say system.out.print. Print on this single, each single line will print license get license ID. So we'll print those IDs. And I have license 2 and 3 over here. 3 objects that I create. So let's save this and run it quickly. Hopefully it'll compile properly. Right, so we run it. First time, of course, all the components are getting loaded, so it takes a little longer. And you can see right here that I have numbers printed 1, 2, 3. Why? Because every time I construct an object, what happens is, let's find out what actually happens. So you know that you can say right click and toggle line breakpoint, which is marked by this little reddish line, and you also have the little square on the line number. And if I run this again by saying debug project, you really tell NetBeans, I want to debug my project. Please start in debug mode, which means that it will be helping you out as the project executes. So let me actually save this as we move along.